Yeah.
So let's start with decolonizing therapy. So can you tell me like the inspiration behind decolonizing therapy and particularly your vantage point from a global perspective on therapy?
Yeah. Well, I think that many of us would agree that some form of mental health, emotional health, and support is essential.
Hmm.
So I think that someone who has been a lover of therapy,
Hmm.
a client of therapy, a
Hmm.
provider of forms of therapy. I'm
Hmm.
trained as a clinical psychologist. And so for the last 20, not currently, but the last 20 something years, therapy has been all I've lived, breathed, done.
Right.
And I would say that as someone who's been on both sides of it, I've been able to look at some of the places where we can improve. And I think that's part of being a critical lover, right? Like something that you
Hmm.
dedicate your life to is
Hmm.
that we have to also, we don't have to, but I would advise us to
Yeah.
take a step back and say, what about this is working? What is great? What do we want to expand on? And what feels expired or outdated and extremely violent and or harmful?
Hmm.
Yeah,
Hmm.
particularly for those of us that have histories
Hmm.
of othered, invisibilized, racism,
Yeah.
sexism,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
on,
Yeah.
stop. And so I worked at a university for 13 years. I was
Hmm.
doing a million and one things
Hmm.
from a community that I was from.
Right.
And I very quickly started realizing that a lot of what folks needed was due to systems falling
Hmm.
apart
Hmm.
and violating them.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So needing
Yeah.
more money, more access,
Right.
right? Requiring more time and space to be with family and loved ones,
Hmm.
right? Wanting more of a cultural connection
Hmm.
to therapy.
Hmm.
And so that was like on the client side, and that's minimizing. That's just wrapping that up. But on
Hmm.
a
Yeah.
provider side, we also had quote unquote caseloads. Notice the language, right?
Yeah.
Very, very
Yeah.
pathologic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Caseloads,
Yeah.
we're talking 50, 60, 70. We had a wait list for four of us of 90 something students, right? So the demand was there,
Hmm.
but they were like, we'll just give them less sessions, right?
Right.
And the issue to that is like, give them less sessions. These are first
Right.
generation college students, predominantly Black, Brown, Arab, right? Like Latinx.
Hmm.
So like,
Hmm.
they're opening up to us for the first time.
Right.
How dare you assume that we can only do 2 sessions with an individual? We got trust issues for very good reasons.
Right.
Not all,
Right.
especially
Right.
if
Right.
you're a college
But
student,
culturally,
right?
yeah.
If I'm
Yeah.
coming into you and telling you something and you sort of resemble me in some way,
Hmm.
right? Then there's a breath I might take. And then there's
Hmm.
another breath and another layer and another
Hmm.
level. Like, are you using my right pronouns? Are you honoring my
Hmm.
accessibility needs? Are
Hmm.
you, right?
Yep.
All these
Yep.
layers. And so I realized that, and I say this with the utmost love and truth, that the kind of therapy I was taught to do was extremely Eurocentric
Hmm.
and extremely Western in the sense that it
Yeah.
didn't take into account family and culture all the
Hmm.
time,
Hmm.
or there were cookbook methods of culture, like
Hmm.
treat all
Yeah.
Black folks like this.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
that's not true.
Yeah. Yeah.
Treat
Yeah.
all, right? Right.
Right.
Or don't talk about yourself. It's never about you. Don't
Hmm.
focus, be a blank slate. Pull
Hmm.
back. Don't,
Hmm.
right? And I realized very quickly that that didn't work for me and that didn't work with who I was serving, right?
Hmm.
That not making it about me, but
Right.
occasionally bringing, being a human, bringing
Yeah.
the relationship in because someone was trusting me
Hmm.
with their stuff.
Hmm.
And I, in turn, had to do a little bit of give and take as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's a little bit of background, right? And
Hmm.
the whole decolonization piece was around, yes, diversity, equity is great. There's a space for
Hmm.
that. Yes,
Hmm.
anti-racism is great. There's a space for
Hmm.
that. Yeah, like, yes, then,
Hmm.
right? And realizing that the mental health system
Hmm.
was serving this bigger system of white body supremacy.
Yeah.
And it was serving this bigger system of keeping folks feeling like they're the problem
Hmm.
rather than realizing that we are the medicine, right? And
Hmm.
then we are
Hmm.
onto something, and maybe we're
Hmm.
not broken, and maybe
Right.
why we're quote unquote depressed or anxious or any of these things might have to do with, again, our system structures and
Yeah.
how they're right?
Yeah.
And so I started talking about this 10 plus years ago, what have you, that wasn't so popular. I
Mm-hmm.
think days that is more
Mm-hmm.
popular and
Of course.
understood. And I think the decolonial part is to look at how, in particular, Indigenous and Black people and others, are
Mm-hmm.
how our land or bodies have been removed,
Mm-hmm.
taken away,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
used as mules and
Yeah.
cattle,
Yeah.
right? Some of the ways that we connect to land, music, song, each other
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
have been violently stripped away from us in order to quote unquote survive.
Yes.
And this whole point is we want to go back to the root, that I don't want to just treat air quotes symptoms
Mm-hmm.
in people.
Mm-hmm.
I want to get to the root of healing. And
Yeah.
9.5 out of 10 in people I worked with, that root of healing had to do with histories
Mm-hmm.
or we were born.
Mm-hmm.
That root of healing had to do with how that was passed down from
Mm-hmm.
one generation to another
Mm-hmm.
generation,
Mm-hmm.
consciously or not.
Yeah.
And that
Yeah.
also had to do with the kind of work and how we were showing up as therapists or social
Mm-hmm.
workers,
Mm-hmm.
psychologists in a system and in a
Yeah.
session,
Yeah.
and whether or not we were dehumanizing people in the way that
Right.
we were doing. Yeah. So in
Yeah.
decolonizing therapy, what we're saying is we want to honor the past
Mm-hmm.
and bring forward newness for the future.
Mm-hmm.
And we want to kind of uproot this system
Mm-hmm.
and start to include ways of healing and not
Mm-hmm.
just treating people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's so fascinating. First of all, so fascinating to listen to you speak. Um, but on this subject in particular, you know, we can only be thankful that we live in a time that we live in, and the world is coming to the places mentally and psychologically and culturally that we're coming to now. Um, there's very much a war history that we are fortunate to not have lived through, and so we're here now, and now is this time and space where um, there is this peeling back of the layers and layers wherein your original lens to your worldview starts from. And if you don't know that you have a Eurocentric lens at the very, 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 very core, or deeply, down in the layers, then everything through the lens is objective if you're not acknowledging the lens. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And the way that we as a culture experience, interact with, observe, and opine on therapy, it is absent of our culture.
Mm-hmm.
We
Mm-hmm.
don't we've been taught not to have our culture as a core part of our therapy, as if there is actually a compartmentalization to our humanity where this part of us is mental health and this part is physical health and this part is emotional health and this part is spiritual health and this
Yeah.
part is psychological health, and not that they all are constantly communicating with, informing, influencing each other, and it's funny. I was talking to Dr. DeForest Stories. He started an organization called D Free. It's a financial um, education
Mm.
platform and tool. And he talked about how, as a culture, there were tools out there for financial help and health. But he said when he started out trying to work on this for his people, um, he realized that the program needed a suntan, so to speak. He's like, there are things that just intrinsically that are what are who and what we are.
Yeah.
He likes to say we clap on 2 and 4. We don't clap on 1 and 3, and that's a real thing deeply, deeply within us that
Mm-hmm.
affects everything and how we engage and interact in this world.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
So, can you talk to me about your point of view and your approach from those various vantage points, the political, the cultural, the
Yeah.
societal, all of it, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Everything you were just saying, I feel it's very spot on. What is it like to go in? This is what I ask therapists when I'm doing
Mm-hmm.
trainings or,
Mm-hmm.
speaking engagements.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like to go into a place you're already a little bit anxious, you're a little bit
Right,
worried, you're about to
right.
give your business,
Mm-hmm.
right? Many
That
of us
part.
have already been taught not to share outside of our homes. It's
Yep.
ingrained. It's
Yep.
ingrained, right? Right? What is it like to go into the space
Yeah.
and have someone sitting across from you or virtually across from
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
that, and we don't expect everyone to speak our language, but
Right.
doesn't understand some semblance of our lived
Mhm.
experience,
Mhm.
right? And doesn't understand, even if we say, oh, I'm past that, I'm not into
Mhm.
that, I'm not
Mhm.
focusing on culture, identity,
Right.
slavery, any of
Right.
it,
Right. Right. Right.
that are very fabric of how we see ourselves in the world because of racial trauma,
Mhm.
right? And let's get
Mhm.
2020 as an example, right?
Yep.
Because
Yep.
of all the
Yep.
violence we witness on ourselves and our
Mhm.
communities,
Mhm.
what is that like to have someone question when you say, I think that there's something that's a bit discriminatory
Mhm.
there, or maybe
Mhm.
we might say the R word, or maybe we have racism, right?
Mhm.
Or maybe
Mhm.
there's something. What is it like to have someone negate or
Yeah.
give a question, or even in their body language,
Mhm.
question, what's the word I want to use? Yeah, kind of like not believe your
Yeah. Like
experience,
question your
right?
experience. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you are a person and or peoples, because this can go for many cultures,
Mhm.
whose lived experience is already questioned,
Mhm.
whose lived experience has already attempted to be exterminated,
Yeah.
whose very ways of walking in the world has been minimized and
Mhm.
pathologized and told it is too violent or
Yeah.
aggressive or this
Yeah.
or that, yet everybody co-ops from our cultures,
Mhm.
right? Like,
Mhm.
what is that
Mhm.
like to walk into a space of so-called help, support, healing, call it what you want to,
Yeah. Yeah.
therapy,
Yeah.
therapeutic,
Yeah.
that doesn't occur. And I'm
Mhm.
talking, the research is telling us that doesn't occur
Mhm.
in great big mass percentages for
Mhm.
the majority of people, even for people that have come to be known as white, right?
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
what does that look, what does that feel like? And
Yeah.
how does that incur further harm? And so part of this work has been
Mhm.
looking at the political, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes when I say the political, folks are like, oh man, I don't talk about the politics. I'm like, I don't
Right.
want to talk about politics either.
Right.
However,
Mhm. Right.
right? However, and my
Yeah.
love, like everything is political,
Mhm.
right? And if you have the privilege to say that something is
Mhm.
not political,
Mhm.
that means there's a whole lot of intersections of privilege where you
Yeah.
don't have to think about how that money's coming in.
Right.
You don't
Right.
have to think about when you're picking up kids. I don't have kids, but for people that do,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
You don't
Mhm.
have to think about,
Yep.
a child being stopped and frisked just
Mhm.
because,
Yep.
right? Or because a youth is wearing locks or dreads or has a
Mhm.
book
Mhm.
bag and is walking fast. What's going to happen to them on their way
Mhm.
home,
Mhm.
right? You don't have to worry about being seen as blank, 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 or blank,
Right. Right.
right? And we're talking about lives. We're
Right.
not just talking about opinions and microaggressions, which
Mhm.
hurt. We're talking
Mhm.
about life or
Mhm.
death,
Mhm.
right? And so it's political whether or not my mother had clean running water
Mhm.
when she was pregnant with me.
Mhm.
It's
Mhm.
political, right? Whether or
Yeah.
not we have access to money for transportation, whether we
Mhm.
have passports,
Mhm.
right? Whether or not we know
Yep.
our families of origin and whether we've been
Yep.
in foster care our whole life.
Mhm.
Political, all
Yeah.
political, right?
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
try to remind people when I say political that it's not a dirty word,
Mhm.
right? And we're not just
Mhm.
talking about like Democrats or Republicans.
Right.
We're not
Right.
talking about
Right.
Trump, right? Or we
Right.
can be,
Right.
but
Right.
we're also talking about access and
Mhm.
equity. And
Mhm.
so that is brought into the space,
Mhm.
right? That is brought into healing.
Mhm.
Um, we also are bringing in the ancestral. What does that mean? Who
Mhm.
are your people?
Mhm.
Okay, you're coming in talking about, I'm making up this example,
Mhm.
issues related to this relationship, and there's violence in this relationship.
Mhm.
Has that shown up in your history?
Mhm.
Was there anything between your parents that was
Mhm.
violent?
Mhm.
Right? How did that show up in literal history?
Mhm.
When were you born? Was it in
Mhm.
another country? Was it in the
Mhm.
middle of a war? I
Right.
want to know how your parents coped.
Yep.
Right? What did they do with those big feelings?
Mhm.
They separated for years
Mhm.
because of
Mhm.
a war, because of
Yeah.
migration, because of, right? So these are not things that
Mhm.
more Eurocentrically trained traditional Western therapists are taught.
Mhm.
We're taught
Mhm.
generally it's
Mhm.
about childhood. And
Mhm.
what Dr. Jen would lovingly say is childhood got something on it. It's part
Mhm.
of it.
Right.
And not
Yeah.
or,
Right.
it's also about our ancestral history and our
Yeah.
people and our roots, right?
Yeah.
That often attachment, we talk about attachment trauma,
Mhm.
right? Like, why can't I
Mhm.
connect to someone? Am I
Mhm.
removed? Am I dismissive?
Mhm.
Is occurring also whether or not we're still able to go back to our land.
Mhm.
Have we ever stepped foot on whatever home
Mhm.
or land is?
Yep.
right? Do we have people that feel like home?
Mm-hmm.
You know, do our communities reflect us in their
Yeah.
bodies, in their colors, in their
Mm-hmm.
talk, right?
Mm-hmm.
We're very lucky on the East Coast in some ways,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it might be a little bit more
Yeah.
of a mirror,
Yeah.
right? Externally anyway. So that's part of it. So we're looking at the political, the ancestral, the
Mm-hmm.
psychological, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
the therapeutic or the mental
Mm-hmm.
health, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, how does this impact our brain and our minds?
Mm-hmm.
Right? When we say we care about land or we care about the people that stewarded the land, like in traditional
Yeah.
decolonization,
Yeah.
how does that happen? Right? How do we go back to that? How do we undo however many, I'm 45, so 45 years of
Mm-hmm.
conditioning
Mm-hmm.
related to,
Yep.
right, this kind of harm,
Yeah.
right, this historical trauma. And so I want to know not just how childhood affected a person, but
Mm-hmm.
where that's showing up in their relationships.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know why maybe people can't make friends. That comes
Mm-hmm.
up in therapies and sessions,
Mm-hmm.
right? Why we say I can't keep a job, or
Yeah.
right, it's just about you and a deficit about you,
Yeah.
or it's deeper to allow people to have more compassion for who they
Mm-hmm.
are,
Mm-hmm.
right? I also want to know how therapy may has harmed you. Have you had
Mm-hmm.
any negative therapy
Mm-hmm.
experiences?
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
Are you allowed to play in therapy even if you're a
Right.
grown adult?
Right.
Or do we do psychodrama? Can we
Mm-hmm.
play ball and
Mm-hmm.
talk? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Do you need me to be on the bus with you and go
Mm-hmm.
somewhere because you need to be somewhere at some time? Like, how
Right.
accessible is therapy? Or are
Right.
we on an ivory tower looking down?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Does that make
Right.
sense? I hope
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
making it feel.
Absolutely.
And then I think the last part is the community and the collective that generally, when most of us these days think of therapy, it's usually related to insurance or we're paying
Mm-hmm.
for insurance, you know.
Yep.
It's once a week for about 45, 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's not always accessible when we're really struggling, right? Like,
Absolutely.
I don't know about you, but I can't just text my
Right.
therapist in the middle of my
Right.
breakdown,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
right? I
Right.
have to have
Right.
boundaries and connect.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do we involve community and
Mm-hmm.
peer support?
Mm-hmm.
How do we involve maybe someone's spirituality and or religion,
Yeah.
right? What if someone heals with these traditional ways, right? What
Right.
if they're very connected to African spirituality or Buddhism,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or any of these other ways,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what if they're Muslim, right? So how
Mm-hmm.
is that included or woven into the healing
Yeah.
work? And so that's when I say
Yeah.
all of these come together,
Mm-hmm.
that therapists, I'm imploring
Mm-hmm.
that we stop getting so comfortable doing it in these very Western ways.
Mm-hmm.
And we start thinking about all the ways that our people healed and still heal.
Right. Right.
And what does that look like when we weave that into where we are now with this
Yeah.
much rage that we're dealing with now?
Yeah. I want to talk about that. Like, I definitely want you to just talk through sacred rage, but even in listening to the points you make about you know our ancestry and the stories that we come from and come through, if it made me think it's almost like if you're standing on a pile of ashes of what was once your house that burned overnight, and then the fire department comes, right? And the fire department requires you to prove that there was a house there before they look through the ashes.
Yes. Yes.
And it's like, well, the one main proof doesn't exist anymore. You know what I mean? I don't have, like, I can't point to the house, right? But in order for you to look through the ashes and do any real work with what is right now, you're asking me to prove that there was a house, you know? Excuse me. And so it's like that with our experiences, stories, observations, whether they be, um, wonderful or traumatic, whatever the case, like the stories, if the stories aren't kept,
Yeah.
then we can't really understand like what we're looking through, what we're working with. And I can only imagine that this plays into what sacred rage is, but I would rather you tell me all about sacred rage.
Uh, yeah, it plays exactly into what sacred rage is, right? Because folks sometimes think that trauma is overused, this word that we
Hmm.
understand as trauma, right?
Hmm.
This feeling that our lives could be taken from us or the
Hmm.
risk of harm of our lives be taken from us. And trauma isn't just what has happened, it's how the people around us responded to what happened. Yeah. And so that's often what creates harm, sadness, loss, grief, rage in someone. It's yes, first this messed up thing happened in my life.
Yeah.
But even more importantly is maybe people didn't believe me, or it was minimized, right? Or people asked me to sweep it under the rug, or dot, 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 right? Or people like cared the first month and then they wanted me to get over it and be strong, suck it up, right? And so the thing is, though, with the experience of trauma is that that's not something that we can just talk our way out of and heal from. It's what I was originally taught. Right? That it also, it's in the body and it gets stuck in the body. And for some of us that might believe in soul or spirit, right? Definitely in the spirit. And definitely to Dr. Roberto and Bonnie Duran, Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, indigenous researchers and therapists that have talked about this soul wound, right? That have talked about this loss of humanity that doesn't just impact me, but it impacts people. And I'm bringing this up because it directly correlates with rage, right? I don't believe that rage and anger are the same, right? Anger is like someone cut me off and I'm pissed off and I'm like, right? Like, how are you gonna do that, right? You know, or pissed because I got some feedback at work that I didn't appreciate and my efforts are not being shown, right? I'm angry. Partner left the seat up, or you know, whatever. They're angers, and some related to just being justice and justification and fairness. But rage, in its purest form, is really and truly old, right? So rage is, yes, big emotions and big feelings, and sometimes people externalize it, and that's what we think of when we think of rage. Right? Like snapping out, harming property, harming someone else, right? But that's not the only form of rage. There's also the rage that we internalize and swallow, which actually is way more common, particularly for a person of color, right? Particularly if you're a body of color that knows that if you have this moment of rage and snap out, you could be locked up or killed, right? And so the internalizing of rage can lead to panic attacks, it can lead to a lot of anxiety. It can lead, right? Because we're trying to hold it all in and there's no place to express it. There's no place to release it. And it can also lead to deep, deep despair and sadness, right? When we hold in something long enough, we feel misunderstood long enough, silent long enough, we start to feel a sadness, an apathy, or resentment. And so my work with rage is really personal and I love it. And my work with rage is for rage to become everyone's best friend. But hear me out, right? I want people to build a relationship to their rage before they pop off. I want people to do and have a relationship with rage before they suck it in and just hold on to it, right? I want us to pay attention to this big emotion that is everywhere these days, from one end of the earth to here, right? Everywhere, that is begging for us to look at patterns in our histories, in our lives, begging for us to look at how some of what we're feeling and what's making us rage. A lot of times people shake when they're feeling enraged, or they cry, like you're holding hot tears. You see kids, right? Like they're breathing heavy, right? That's rage. It's grief. It is rage, right? It also tells us that boundaries are being crossed. Rage, honestly, could be everyone's barometer. Oh, wait, something's off here. Or wait, I don't like how I'm being treated. That doesn't mean we have to respond and react immediately. That's kind of what I teach youth, right? We don't have to respond to all this. What is it like to take that 10, 15 second or minute processing moment before I respond? And can I do that, right? So rage, when I say it's old, I mean that it is reigniting some of these old ancestral wounds, right? So I'm going to give you some examples, because we were talking about it before. In the midst of the height of the pandemic, we're also witnessing, you know, and sorry to again bring this up because it could be a little traumatic for some of us, right? We're also witnessing, because of social media, and many of us are home, we're witnessing the very brutal murders of Ahmaud Arbery,
Mm-hmm.
right? George Floyd,
Mm-hmm.
Breonna Taylor.
Mm-hmm.
Then before that, then there's Trayvon Martin. There we could keep going, but then there's also
Mm-hmm.
people in the community.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there's some of our family members that are going through it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're witnessing this massive violence on Black bodies, and no one is really talking about how unsafe
Mm-hmm.
that feels deeply.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Really, how unsafe, because that would make us vulnerable,
Yeah.
right? And so that isn't just bringing up, oh, we knew this, we've
Mm-hmm.
seen this, we grew up with it. Like,
Right.
this is
Right.
common.
Right.
Not
Yeah.
common, but like, I'm glad you're all seeing it. This is
Yeah.
great.
This didn't just start.
This didn't just start,
Right.
right? Maybe cameras are just on, or everyone's paying
Right.
attention.
Mm-hmm.
And what does that mean when all eyes are on this now?
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to my safety? And what wounds are coming up that are a reminder of enslavement? What
Mm-hmm.
wounds are coming up that are a reminder of what happens when people start learning about things?
Mm-hmm.
What wounds are coming up that are old as well as current?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that makes sense, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
rage is the love child
Mm-hmm.
of ancestral trauma,
Mm-hmm.
right? Older trauma, grief that has been pushed down,
Mm-hmm.
and shame, right?
Mm-hmm.
So rage is this love child of
Mm-hmm.
trauma, shame, and
Mm-hmm.
grief.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't believe that this rage should be pushed down and silenced, because that's what causes it to pop off.
Right. Right. Right.
Right?
Right.
Like when you put a kid in a room by themselves, that you're like, you're punished, which
Right.
is so horrible. You do it in hospitals all the time, right? And they're
Mm-hmm.
separating and segregating and dividing. Not only is just that not healthy for a human and a kid who
Yep.
needs to expel and
Yep.
punch and kick things and give them pillows, give them writing utensils, give them, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
let them sing at the top of their lungs, or like
Mm-hmm.
pop off with some rap, right? Or something, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a reminder in their bodies, even if they've never experienced it,
Mm-hmm.
of being shackled, of being imprisoned,
Mm-hmm.
being quarantined, of being
Mm-hmm.
divided, conquered. Does that make right? So this
Yeah.
youth may not know that consciously, like, hey, my
Right.
body is remembering things I didn't
Right.
experience.
Right. Right.
But I can tell you, as an intergenerational trauma psychologist, as a
Mm-hmm.
person who studied colonization, intergenerational trauma, and
Mm-hmm.
worked with trauma my whole life, and
Mm-hmm.
particularly in Black and Brown communities and poor communities, that our bodies remember traumas that we never experienced, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
that's what intergenerational trauma is,
Right.
right? That DNA expression,
Mm-hmm.
it changes and it impacts us,
Mm-hmm.
whether we're talking about domestic violence,
Mm-hmm.
substance abuse,
Yeah.
skills, right? It also
Yeah.
passes down beautiful things,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Like
Yes.
great singing voice, great
Mm-hmm.
style,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not all doom and gloom.
Right.
It's also told us how to survive and be
Mm-hmm.
resilient.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so I'm saying all this, it's not all heavy. The reality is, the more that we have a relationship to our rage,
Yeah.
the more some semblance of control we have,
Mm-hmm.
and the more we can trust our intuition. We
Mm-hmm.
can trust when something feels off, and we can also learn how to deal with that grief underneath that wants to
Mm-hmm.
be as
Mm-hmm.
well. Because you don't have trauma, you don't have grief without rage, and you don't have
Mm-hmm.
rage without grief. They're
Mm-hmm.
both
Mm-hmm.
interconnected.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Some of us just do rage a little better, or do anger a
Right.
little better,
Right.
and some of us do depression and
Mm-hmm.
despair a little
Mm-hmm.
better. Hope that
Mm-hmm.
makes some
Mm-hmm.
sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. It's one of those things where I've lived it, so I get it. You know, I've lived it in observations through childhood. I've lived it in my personal experience. I've lived it in the stories that have come to me that I've read and heard about, whatnot. Um, I want to be mindful of time, so I just want to ask, finally, um, how can people connect with you online?
Yeah. Yeah, so apparently Instagram is a thing now. For like, I never meant to be on Instagram. My students placed me on Instagram.
Okay.
So you can locate me at Decolonizing Therapy on
Hmm.
Instagram.
Hmm.
Uh, Also our website, decolonizingtherapy.com or drjennifermullan.com. We have affordable sliding scale courses on rage, on
Hmm.
grief, on
Hmm.
boundaries. If you're an organization that is seeking for us to talk a little bit more about what politicizing your practice looks like, how to
Hmm.
make it colonial, you
Hmm.
can reach out. We have a series for that. I also do workshops, presentations,
Yeah.
keynotes, consulting, because we need to talk about it more. We
Hmm.
need to
Hmm.
talk about how the pain of the past doesn't magically disappear, as you said,
Right.
and that the onus is not on us to say, hey, there was a house there. Yeah, it
Right.
burned down, but
Hmm.
like my
Hmm.
mind and body are still grieving that
Hmm.
house.
Hmm.
I
Right.
miss my
Right.
pictures. I miss
Right.
my
Right.
social security card, right?
Right. 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 Right.
Right. And so my job, I think, in this world is to continue to uplift
Hmm.
that which is so obvious that we look over it all the
Hmm.
time, and that which is
Hmm.
so deep that we're afraid to descend into. And that's what decolonizing therapy is pulling things
Hmm.
up by the root and lovingly examining them in community.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for sharing this your insights with us. And I want to do this again. Talk to you again soon, please.
It would be my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. My pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Okay, talk soon.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.